Up until tonight, Anna had always felt secure in her own house. She had gone to bed after a long day, and the night had started off normally. But everything changed when her teenage nephew, Peter, showed up at the doorway. Something didn't feel quite right. Even though she believed she had locked the door, the cool sheets were sticking to Anna's bare skin as she stretched out on her bed. After a long and tiring day, she was finally able to relax in her home's peaceful seclusion. Through the window, a warm glow was cast by the sun as it dipped low outside. She let herself relax and let out a slow exhale. She sat up when she heard the nearby floorboards creak. As she looked toward the doorway, her heart skipped a beat. Standing there, his figure faintly illuminated by the hallway light, was her teenage nephew, Peter. "What are you doing up, Peter?" she said, in a quiet but inquisitive tone. He moved uncomfortably, his eyes darting to one side and then back to hers. "I had trouble falling asleep. I just got a drink of water." Anna's brows furrowed. "It's late," she said softly. "You should be asleep." In an attempt to dismiss it, Peter didn't move. Instead, he approached slowly and deliberately. Anna's heart pounded in her chest. His eyes remained fixed on her, and she automatically pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I thought I heard something," she said. When she asked again, Peter, in a more circumspect tone, replied, "Did you forget to lock the door?" Peter murmured in a tentative tone. Anna's stomach tightened. "I'm sure I locked it earlier," she replied quickly, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. "It's fine, just go back to bed." But Peter didn't answer. He kept coming closer, his steps slow and measured. Anna's breathing grew shallow, her eyes darting between him and the doorway. "Peter!" Her voice was a warning now. "What are you doing?" He stopped just at the edge of her bed, his eyes clear and searching, lingering on her for a moment too long. Anna shifted slightly, uncomfortable beneath his gaze, and then it happened. His gaze dropped briefly but unmistakably to her legs. A chill ran down Anna's spine. The realization hit her hard. He had seen her, her bare skin, her exposed thighs. He had caught sight of her, and now he was standing there watching her. Her heart pounded harder. Anna's breath hitched in her throat. "Peter!" she snapped, her voice rising in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Peter's eyes darted away, his face flushing. "I didn't mean to." Before he could finish, Anna's voice hardened. "Get out," she commanded, pointing toward the door. "Now go to your room." Peter's face went pale, and without another word, he turned and fled the room, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Wondering what had just happened, Anna sat there in stunned silence, trembling. If you're interested, please like, share, and subscribe. What follows? Still shaking from the experience, Anna sat on the edge of her bed. The silence in the room felt oppressive, and her heart was pounding, half expecting Peter to return. She looked toward the door, but the house was still eerily silent. She kept replaying the scene in her head, Peter's presence, his eyes on her, that fleeting, awkward slip. As she rubbed her temples in an attempt to calm herself, she couldn't get rid of the feeling that something had changed between them. Her mother heard Peter's hushed voice from the other side of the door and was startled by a sudden knock. Anna's eyes grew wide as she experienced a surge of anxiety and bewilderment. "What are you looking for?" she inquired cautiously. "I'm sorry, I didn't intend to." There was a pause on the other side of the door, and then Peter whispered, "Please just let me in for a minute. I need to talk." Anna's jaw tightened and her fingers clenched into fists. "Go to bed, Peter. I need some time alone." Anna hesitated. She was uneasy about something desperate in his voice, but she sighed and unlocked the door against her better judgment. Peter entered as it slowly creaked open. His posture was rigid, almost awkward, and his eyes darted to the floor instead of meeting her gaze right away. "I couldn't tell," he started, his voice trembling a little. "I didn't intend for things to become strange. I'm sorry." Anna frowned, her tone sharp. "You think this is just weird?" Peter sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Look, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. I wasn't thinking." Anna took a step forward. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice cold. "You come into my room in the middle of the night and look at me like—" "I wasn't looking." "On purpose!" Peter interrupted quickly, his face flushed, and he looked genuinely troubled. "It just happened," Anna grumbled. "It just happened." As she crossed her arms, she continued, "You saw me, Peter." As if it didn't matter, he replied, "You saw me wearing only half of my clothes." For the first time, she noticed something darker. Something other than guilt. A flicker of attention she couldn't quite put her finger on. As Peter's eyes finally raised to meet hers, he muttered, "It's difficult to forget, even though I didn't mean to." Anna's throat tightened with breath. "Just what did you say?" Her voice was hardly audible now, a whisper. Peter's jaw tensed as he hesitated. "What I saw is difficult to forget." Between them, the air became thicker with unsaid thoughts, residual, guilt, and something much more disturbing. Anna sensed that something was amiss, that something was dangerous. "You must go!" Finally, in a firm, sharp voice, she said, "Leave. Return to your room. We'll forget this ever happened." Peter's eyes fell once more. "I am unable to—" Anna squinted her eyes. "What were you saying?" "I can't get it off my mind." The air between them became heavier, heavy with unsaid thoughts, lingering guilt, and something far more unsettling. "About you," Peter whispered, almost to himself. Anna's heart was racing with a mixture of anger and fear as her eyes narrowed. At last, in a firm and piercing voice, she said, "You must go. Go back to your room, Peter. We'll forget this ever happened." Peter's gaze dropped again. "I can't." Anna's eyes narrowed. "What did you say?" "I can't stop thinking about it," Peter whispered, almost to himself. "About you." Anna's breath hitched. "Stop it. Just stop." She turned away, pacing toward the window, her fists clenched at her sides as she tried to shake off the suffocating feeling of vulnerability. "This isn't right. This shouldn't have happened." Peter walked slowly, but deliberately after her. He said in a hushed tone, "I don't know why it feels like this, but it does, and I can't just forget it." Anna's eyes flashed with confusion and frustration as she spun around. "It's not normal. You're my nephew. We don't simply ignore this issue." Peter's face grew serious. "It wasn't supposed to happen. It didn't begin this way." Anna's heart was beating more rapidly now. She had no control over the situation as it deteriorated into something darker. "What are you looking for from me?" Her voice broke as she whispered. Peter stepped forward, his eyes intense and probing. "I'm not sure. I simply— Anna, I have a feeling that won't go away." Anna's breathing accelerated as her mind worked to ignore the growing panic. This was dangerous. It was no longer just a simple misunderstanding. She stepped back and said firmly, "You need help!" Peter interrupted, raising his voice a little. "I don't need help. I just need you to understand. You need to talk to someone," he said. "You must see it for what it truly is." Anna's eyes went wide with surprise. "You are, in fact, my nephew. It's twisted. This is not for you to decide. It's incorrect." Peter's jaw tightened as his face twisted. "I think it's real. This isn't how I asked it to be. I simply sensed something." Anger made Anna's voice waver. "You must put an end to this immediately. It's not a game." Peter's eyes met hers, and she couldn't help but notice something primal and dangerous about them. "I can't." His tone was softer now, but no less firm. Anna's hands trembled at her sides. She felt like she was losing control. "You don't have a choice. You can stop." Peter stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "I'm sorry, but I don't know if I can." Anna's chest tightened, and she took a step back, instinctively bumping into the edge of her bed. Her pulse throbbed violently as she felt trapped, not just physically, but mentally. "Get out," she whispered. "Get out before I—" But before she could finish, Peter's voice cut through the tension. "We're connected now. There's no going back." The room spun around Anna. Her breathing became ragged, panic bubbling beneath the surface. She had to get away. She had to stop this from going any further. "You're my nephew!" she snapped, shaking her head in disbelief. "You can't mean what you're saying!" Peter's gaze softened, but it didn't waver. "I do, and I don't know what to do with it anymore. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to know what happens next." Anna sat motionless on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. The weight of Peter's words hung in the air, suffocating her thoughts and fears alike. She felt like she was trapped in a nightmare, one she couldn't seem to wake up from. Her chest tightened, and she ran her hands through her hair, trying to steady her breathing. She knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was something darker, something that threatened to unravel everything she had once believed. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, pulling her attention. A message from her best friend Sarah popped up. "Sarah, hey, hope you're doing okay. We need to talk soon. Call me when you can." Anna stared at the screen, unable to focus on the words. Her fingers hovered over the keys, but she couldn't respond. The only thing on her mind was Peter. His eyes, his confession, his touch. How did things get this far? The memory of their interaction replayed in her mind like a broken record, each detail more vivid than the last. The way he looked at her, the way his hand trembled. Those weren't mistakes. It was real. And it had happened because it couldn't be undone. Her thoughts spiraled as she realized something more chilling. It wasn't just a momentary lapse. Peter had been watching her, studying her longer than she'd realized, and now she was forced to confront a truth she had buried deep inside. This wasn't something she could brush off. It wasn't just a fleeting attraction. It was something deeper, something dangerous. As Anna's mind began to whirl, she caught a glimpse of movement. From the corner of her eye, Peter was standing in the doorway once again, his expression unreadable, but there was something calculated in his gaze this time, something unsettling. "I shouldn't have come in here," Peter muttered, breaking the silence. Anna looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. "No, you shouldn't have. You shouldn't have said what you did. You shouldn't have." "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," Peter said quickly, interrupting her. "I'm sorry, I can't control it." Anna's fists clenched tightly in her lap. "Peter, this isn't something you simply can't control. You made me feel something I've never felt before." Anna flinched, her stomach twisted in disgust. "That's not an excuse! You're my family, my nephew!" I know what it looks like, Peter said softly, his voice barely audible above a whisper. But I can't help how I feel. This is wrong. Peter's jaw tightened, his eyes darkened. Never in my life have I felt this way about someone. Anna felt a mixture of fear and rage bubbling inside her before her breathing quickened. This is not possible. We cannot continue to act as though this is not taking place. Peter stepped forward, his eyes fixed on hers. Peter's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. But we can't pretend it isn't there either. Anna stood up suddenly, her eyes flashing. We have to pretend. You need to walk away from this. Forget what you think you feel. It's not that simple. Anna's heart began to race. It must be that simple. I refuse to allow this to ruin everything. I won't. Peter's voice lowered as his face grew even more sinister. You can't stop it, not now. Anna's fists clenched tighter. I'm your aunt. I raised you. How could you let this happen? Peter's eyes glimmered with something dangerous, something she hadn't seen before. It wasn't just me, it was you too. Anna staggered back, her body trembling. The words hit her like a blow, ripping through her every defense. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Peter's voice trailed off, but the damage had already been done. Like, share, and subscribe if you want to know what happens next. The tension between Anna and Peter hung heavily in the air, suffocating every sound and movement. Anna paced back and forth, her mind racing, trying to make sense of what had just been said, what had just happened. Her breaths were shallow, and her heart pounded in her chest. How had things spiraled so far out of control? How had she let him get this close? Peter, on the other hand, stood silently, watching her every move with quiet intensity. His expression was unreadable, but Anna could see the internal struggle behind his eyes, as if he knew deep down that what they had done could never be undone. Finally, she stopped in her tracks, spinning to face him. Her voice came out cold and sharp. You can't keep doing this, Peter. You can't. Peter's gaze didn't waver, though his jaw tightened. It's not something I can just turn off. Anna, her eyes narrowed, it is not appropriate for you to experience this. This is incorrect. Even though Peter said it in a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper, my feelings remain the same. Tears stung the corners of Anna's eyes, and her chest constricted. There should be no relationship like this between us. My family is you. You were raised by me. How could you have allowed yourself to feel this? Peter's lips pressed into a thin line as his face darkened. It happened, even though I didn't plan for it to, and I can't ignore it anymore. You don't need to continue to feel this way. The room spun slightly as Anna's mind struggled to process his words. You have to. You must. I won't let you ruin everything. Our family, our lives. This isn't just about feelings anymore, Peter. This is dangerous. Peter's eyes softened momentarily, but there was a vulnerability in his expression. That made Anna pause. You need to walk away from this before it destroys both of us, she said, her voice rising slightly, desperate and angry at the same time. You're afraid, I understand. Anna firmly shook her head and said, I didn't mean for this to happen, but now that it's out, we can't pretend it didn't. Peter's eyes hardened once more. It's too late. I can't pretend it didn't happen. Every time I see you, every time we're alone together, I feel it. I feel something between us and it's not going away. Anna felt her body go rigid, a wave of cold fear wash over her. You're my nephew. This can't continue. Peter's voice lowered, dark and quiet. I've already crossed a line that I can't get back. It can't stop now. The words sank in one after the other, and Anna's chest heaved. Her mind screamed for an escape, but there was none, and her breathing became erratic. She knew in her heart that Peter would not stop, and she was powerless to stop what had already started. Right now, he couldn't. In the days that followed, there was an unsaid tension that pervaded the air like a dense mist between Anna and Peter. They went about their daily lives, speaking only when absolutely necessary and avoiding extended eye contact. But no matter how hard they tried, the tension never seemed to go away. Every look and second that went by between them brought them one step closer to the inevitable. One evening, while Anna was sitting by herself in the living room, aimlessly browsing through her phone, Peter slipped in. His footsteps were slow, almost cautious, and Anna didn't look up from the screen, but she could sense his presence, as if her body knew when he was close. Finally, Peter spoke, his voice soft but strained. "We need to talk." Anna set her phone down on the coffee table. She crossed her arms and gazed steadily as she turned to face him. "We've already talked enough, Peter." "No," he insisted, stepping closer. "We haven't really said what needs to be said." Anna's heart pounded in her chest. She could already feel the trap closing in. What is there left to say? Peter, this shouldn't be happening. It shouldn't even be possible. Peter stopped right in front of her, his expression filled with a quiet intensity. It doesn't matter what should or shouldn't be. What matters is that it's happening, and we can't ignore it anymore. Anna's jaw tightened, her fingers twitching at her sides. But it can be ignored. We have to ignore it. It's the only way to protect everything we have, our family, our peace. Peter's eyes softened, his voice nearly breaking. "But it feels real. It is real." Anna shook her head, her voice wavering. "No, it can't be. We're not supposed to feel this. It's not meant to be." "Sometimes," Peter whispered, "things don't follow rules. Sometimes they break them. And maybe, just maybe, what we feel was never meant to be ignored." The weight of his words hung between them, heavy and unrelenting. Anna felt her breath catch in her throat, unable to look away from him. Peter murmured, her voice trembling. "We can't." But Peter reached out slowly, his hand brushing against hers, his touch gentle but firm. "We already do." Anna's breath hitched, her body trembling beneath his touch. She briefly allowed herself to experience the forbidden spark that still blazed. Between them, the irresistible attraction and the longing. But then reality struck her like a blast of cold water. She took a quick step back and yanked her hand away. "We are no longer the only ones affected. This is a larger issue." Peter's voice was low but firm. "If someone finds out, if they know, I'll do whatever it takes to keep it from coming out. No one can tear us apart, and I won't allow it." Fear and longing wore on Anna, causing her heart to pound painfully in her chest. "You don't understand. We can't stop this. Peter, it's already getting out of control. We're headed for a collision regardless of what we do, and I'm not sure if we can stop it." Peter took another step forward. "Maybe we're meant to face it together," he said, in a softer, almost begging voice. "It doesn't matter what we're meant to do. What matters is what's right, and this isn't right." Anna shook her head, her eyes welling with tears. "We can make it right," Peter argued, his expression desperate. "We can find a way." "No!" Anna snapped, her voice shaking with resolve. "We will not, and we cannot. I won't let us go down that path." Peter's shoulders drooped a little, a flicker of defeat crossing his face. But what would happen if we continued to ignore it? What would happen to us if we tried to move on? Anna took a deep breath, forcing herself to control her emotions. We move forward. We pretend it never happened. We pretend that none of this ever happened. Peter's jaw clenched tightly. But it's not that simple. No, Anna said softly, her voice breaking. It never was. And with that she turned away, heading for the door, leaving Peter standing in the silence, their connection broken, at least, for the time being. But she knew deep down that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a silent war between them that they would have to fight every day for as long as they lived.